For most of us, the life cycle of our smartphone begins and ends in our ownership, but our smartphones have a lot longer life cycles than we might think about. Before arriving at wherever you purchased it, your smartphone had to be entirely sourced and built, likely half a world away from where you are right now, and then shipped across the globe. Then it was packaged, again most likely not where it was sold, and shipped again. And so you use it for a few years, most likely somewhere between 2 and 3 years, as is the average, and then trade it in, sell it, or keep it in the back of your drawer. Eventually, that smartphone winds up joining many others in a pile of electronic waste, or e-waste, and most likely ends up another half a world away in some kind of electronics graveyard. Seems fairly logical, right? This little device, smaller than many of the other things that end up being thrown away are, eventually harmlessly ends up where everything else we don't want anymore goes. Except, most people don't replace everything they own every 2 to 3 years. In fact, many of the things that we use just as often as our smartphones and pay roughly the same amount of money for, such as mattresses, are kept for over 3.5 times as long. And with roughly 217 million smartphones floating around in the United States alone, that's a lot of smartphones going to the dumps every year. Like, a lot. So why not just keep our devices longer than 3 years? In the world of technology, there is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, particularly regarding smartphones. That phrase is planned obsolescence, and is generally used to refer to a company purposefully manufacturing and advertising their products so that consumers purchase new ones within a couple of years. In fact, a short survey that examined people's smartphone replacement habits and understandings of planned obsolescence revealed that 68% of those who provided a definition of what they thought planned obsolescence was emphasized only the role of the company in creating a culture of replacing smartphones before it's really necessary. And while the companies that create and market these products are certainly to blame, they alone are not contributing to the piles of smartphone waste that accumulate each year. In fact, the same survey showed that 78.8% of respondents had replaced phones that were still working in some capacity, and just under half of the people surveyed admitted replacing their old phone because the new one was fancier, better, or more attractive. This revelation connects to a point made by author Camilla Pope in the book Understanding Planned Obsolescence, where it is argued that capitalism and consumerism create a sense of, quote, perpetual non-satisfaction amongst consumers, and in an attempt to be satisfied, people consume goods at unsustainable paces. Consistently unhappy consumers, combined with the opportunity to consume, equals a society in which planned obsolescence is toxic but unavoidable. But the problem doesn't stop there, because sadly, our smartphones don't just compost into the environment the same way food waste does when we throw it out. And similarly, they don't just grow on trees. The environmental consequences of smartphones start before the phones are even pieced together. Lithium-ion batteries are at the core of our modern smartphones, and at the core of these batteries is a mineral called cobalt. Cobalt has to be mined from the earth, a process that uses a lot of fossil fuels and releases large amounts of particulate matter into the surrounding environment, reducing air and water quality. Additionally, most of the world's cobalt is sourced from Congo, where miners often work and sometimes sleep in unregulated mines for very little money, and where residents who live in mining areas are subject to increased likelihoods of respiratory diseases and birth defects. And, because cobalt is not monitored under the same legislation that monitors the mining of materials like gold and tin, nobody's held accountable for what goes on in the mining process. And often, the companies driving the cobalt demand deny or are not aware of this aspect of the smartphone's journey to sale. As an example, Apple's webpage on why lithium-ion doesn't even address where or how the lithium-ion batteries are made. And the impact continues, as in order to assemble and package the smartphone, it and all of its components must be shipped around the world, spanning sometimes up to 43 countries across 6 continents before even being sold. Every shipment requires some sort of most likely fossil fuel consuming form of transport. And then, when you finally receive the smartphone, you charge it over and over and over, using electricity every time you plug it in. And once the smartphone has finally reached the end of its viable usage time, it becomes e-waste, a special type of waste that must be handled separately from regular trash. The e-waste recycling process is complicated, dangerous, and expensive, and because this process is so heavily restricted in wealthier countries, often becomes the problem of a poor country like Ghana, where people of all ages wander through piles of e-waste dating back to the 1980s. The waste doesn't just take up space, the local residents also depend on it to make a living. often burning various materials to expose the valuable metals underneath, all while inhaling the toxic fumes. As the title of one article depicting this scene accurately describes it, quote, "The health risks are obvious, but the money's too good to ignore." Thus, the more that planned obsolescence pushes society to replace smartphones, the more smartphones get dumped and created, and on and on and on, and the deeper the world dives into an environmental and humanitarian crisis that we can't afford. On the upside, we have not reached a point of no return. Yet. With a combined effort of corporations, governments, and the people consuming these devices, we can make planned obsolescence obsolete. The most obvious solution would be to just stop buying new devices when we don't really need them. But this is a lot easier said than done. According to survey results, the average time before smartphone replacement was 3.38 years for non-Gen Z respondents and 2.88 years for Gen Z respondents, showing that while there is somewhat of a difference across generational mindsets and replacement habits, it's a mere 6 months. People across all generations have internalized the idea that a new device is needed after only a few years, to the point of being able to identify that this is a consequence of planned obsolescence, but not necessarily understanding what role they play. On top of that, these devices are not necessarily made to last. Companies market new products almost yearly, oftentimes highlighting extremely minor changes in a way that makes them seem more consequential than they really are. Additionally, certain restrictions and limitations prevent third parties and consumers themselves from repairing or replacing components on most smartphones, and going directly through the company to fix the phone is sometimes more expensive than just buying a new one. So what can be done? For starters, awareness of this issue needs to be more commonplace. While it is the consumer's responsibility to educate themselves on the product they are looking to purchase, companies can assist in this effort by making their product journeys much clearer. Smartphones could also be designed more like the Fairphone, an eco-conscious smartphone that is completely modular and can be fixed at home. Or governmental regulations could at least require that the phones be fixable by someone other than the company that makes them. Investments and improvements in the e-waste recycling process could keep more of the waste being treated domestically in regulated environments, and less advertising could keep consumers from fostering the idea that it's time to replace their devices before they really need to. Speaking from the perspective of someone born in this century, we've been raised to aspire to be more technologically advanced, more widely interconnected, and as powerful as possible, and our smartphones make this possible, accessible, and easy. But at what cost? Our environment is already starting to collapse under the weight of the billions of people it must support, and unless we figure out a way to be more sustainable in everything we do, and quickly, we will have no choice but to confront the problem that we have all contributed to. We are, quite literally, on the brink of drowning in smartphones, and it's about time we learn how to swim.